I was the official documenting photographer for the Shroud of Turin research project. Shroud of Turin research project was the first and only scientific team ever to be given permission to do an in-depth examination of the Shroud of Turin. No one thought the shroud would reveal its mysteries like this. Yet instead of ancient texts or faded ink, it's the microscopic fibers themselves that are telling the story more powerfully than any history book ever has. What makes it even more astonishing is this. Some of the DNA traces found within those tiny threads are incredibly rare. In fact, certain markers seem to have survived in a way that modern science still doesn't fully understand, let alone reproduce. The shroud is an image of a crucified man with wounds that correspond to the brutality that Jesus of Nazareth experienced. So why do you think it's real? They cannot explain how the image is in the shroud. This detail matters more than most people realize. It shows that the image on the fabric isn't the only mystery that defies explanation. There's something else there, something just as extraordinary. While rumors continue to swirl, one thing many researchers agree on is that the genetic material discovered on the cloth could completely reshape our understanding of history. And at the center of it all stands a determined photographer, suddenly confronted with evidence that challenges everything we thought was possible. The story goes back to 1978, when a group of highly respected scientists traveled to Italy carrying enough equipment to set up a full laboratory. Among them was Barry Schwartz, a professional technical photographer who had worked with organizations like NASA and was accustomed to documenting things most people would never get the chance to see. At the time, he was a complete skeptic. He was confident that within a few hours of examining the cloth, he would expose it as a medieval hoax. In his mind, someone had simply painted a convincing image to deceive the public centuries ago. He even joked with his colleagues that the trip was basically a free vacation to Italy and that they would wrap up their work and head home before the week ended. But everything shifted the moment he entered the room where the shroud was kept. The mood felt different, serious, almost overwhelming. Spread out before him was a long linen cloth, about 14 feet in length and 3 feet wide. On it appeared the faint outline of a man who had clearly endured intense physical suffering. What he saw in that moment was far from the simple forgery he had expected. Schwartz carefully set up his cameras and began capturing thousands of high-resolution photographs. His goal was simple: find the tiny brushstrokes or traces of paint that would prove the whole thing was a forgery. He used specialized lighting and filters designed to detect even the faintest hint of pigment or dye hidden in the threads. But here's what stunned him. No matter how closely he examined it, the image refused to give up that kind of evidence. There were no brush marks, no pulled paint, no signs that any liquid substance had been applied to form the face or body. What many people don't realize is even more surprising. The image exists only on the very top surface of the fibers. It doesn't soak through to the back of the cloth. It's almost as if the discoloration barely touched the outermost layer. In simple terms, it resembles a photographic negative, yet it appeared nearly 2,000 years before cameras were ever invented. This detail is crucial because it strongly suggests the image wasn't created by human hands. And that's where things started to get unsettling for the research team. The more experiments they conducted, the more uneasy the scientists became. At one point, they used a device called the VP-8 image analyzer, a machine originally developed for NASA to turn space images into three-dimensional maps of planets. Normally, when you feed a regular photograph into the machine, the result is a warped, distorted image. But when they processed a photograph of the shroud, something extraordinary happened. A clear, accurate, three-dimensional human form appeared on the screen. It was as if the cloth contained depth and physical information, almost like a record of a real body that had once been there. For the scientists in that lab, it was one of the most shocking moments of their careers. Then came another twist. The image itself functions like a photographic negative. Light and dark areas are reversed in a way that produces a more lie-like image when inverted. And still, no brush strokes, no paint, No artistic technique could be identified anywhere on the fabric. But that wasn't even the biggest challenge for modern science. The mystery of how the image formed was only the beginning. The team spent more than 120 continuous hours examining every inch of the cloth, running test after test, yet they couldn't find a single clear, logical explanation for what they were seeing. They searched for burn patterns from heat, but there were none. They tested for chemical vapors that might have reacted with the linen and created a shadow-like imprint. Again, nothing. They even considered whether natural gases released from a body could have caused the image, but that theory didn't hold up either. Gases would have spread unevenly and blurred the details. The face on the cloth, however, was distinct and sharply defined. Night after night, Schwartz found himself staring at his photographs, questioning everything. As a Jewish man, he had no personal mission to validate a Christian miracle. In fact, he had arrived expecting to debunk one. But the evidence in front of him wasn't influenced by belief or background. The data stood on its own. Many in the scientific community anticipated uncovering a clever forgery. Instead, they were confronted with a mystery that seemed to challenge the known laws of physics. Their analysis suggested the image may have formed through a burst of energy that dehydrated the cellulose within the linen fibers. Pause and think about that. It would be as if a sudden flash of light altered the chemical structure of the cloth in an instant without setting it on fire. That detail is critical because even with today's advanced technology, we don't have a method capable of producing that kind of large-scale surface change without completely burning the material. Speculation continues, and theories still circulate. But when it comes to conclusions published in peer-reviewed scientific journals, the answer remains consistent. No one has definitively explained how it was done. The image on the cloth is unbelievably thin, measured in micrometers, even thinner than a single human hair. If someone were to gently scrape the very top of one fiber with a razor blade, the image would vanish, revealing plain white linen underneath. That alone shows the discoloration isn't soaked into the fabric like paint would be. It only affects the outermost surface. What many people also don't realize is that the image lines up mathematically with the shape of a body that appears to have been suspended slightly above the cloth. The proportions and alignment suggest it wasn't simply pressed flat against it. But as puzzling as the image was, the bloodstains raised even more questions. The cloth showed clear signs of intense physical trauma, wounds consistent with a violent struggle, almost as if a dying man had left behind biological traces. For nearly 20 years, it was the blood that kept Schwartz from accepting the shroud as authentic. When he examined the stains, they appeared bright red, and everyone knows that ancient blood should darken over time, turning brown or even black. To him, that seemed like strong evidence that an artist had used red pigment to make the wounds look fresh and dramatic. Then one day, he received a call from Alan Adler, a respected biochemist who had spent his career studying the chemistry of blood. Adler explained something unexpected. The red coloration wasn't a sign of forgery at all. In fact, according to his analysis, it was one of the strongest indicators that the blood on the cloth could be real. Here's something most people don't know. When someone goes through extreme physical trauma for hours, the body begins to shut down. The liver can break down under that stress, releasing high levels of a chemical called bilirubin into the bloodstream. And bilirubin does something surprising. It can help preserve a reddish color in blood. So, if a man had been severely beaten and tortured before dying, the blood on a cloth could remain red far longer than people normally expect. This matters because it suggests the blood came from a real human being who had experienced intense shock and suffering. When researchers tested the stains, they didn't find any traces of paint or artificial dyes. Instead, they detected human hemoglobin and albumin, clear biological markers of real blood. Another important detail is the sequence of events. The blood was on the cloth before the image formed. That means the man was first wrapped in the linen. His blood seeped into the fibers, and only afterward did whatever created the image occur, forming around the existing bloodstains. Laboratory analysis also indicated the blood belonged to a male with a type commonly found in the Middle East. The wounds themselves tell a brutal story. More than 100 lash marks consistent with a Roman whip known as a flagrum. Researchers even identified tiny soil particles near the feed area that matched the region around Jerusalem, adding yet another layer to the mystery surrounding the shroud. In many ways, the cloth resembled a carefully preserved forensic crime scene, one that silently documented the details of a brutal execution. Every stain, every mark, every fiber seemed to hold a fragment of a larger story. The wrists showed clear signs of puncture wounds consistent with spikes being driven through them. Not through the palms, as often depicted in artwork, but through the wrists, exactly where the bones could support the weight of a body. The side of the torso bore a deep wound that aligned with the shape and placement of a Roman spear thrust. Blood patterns suggested it flowed in a way that matched gravity, as if the body had been upright at the time the wounds were inflicted. The back of the image revealed extensive scourge marks, dozens upon dozens, consistent with a severe Roman flogging. The shoulders appeared eroded, as though they had carried something heavy for a long distance. Even the head area showed small puncture wounds consistent with sharp objects pressed into the scalp. Altogether, it painted a chilling and highly detailed picture of suffering. But as disturbing as the physical evidence was, the most puzzling layer of the mystery wasn't visible to the naked eye. It was hidden deep within the microscopic traces left behind inside the DNA. In recent years, advances in genetic sequencing technology have made it possible to analyze even the smallest and oldest biological samples. With tools far more sophisticated than those available decades ago, researchers decided it was time to take another look at the genetic material found on the cloth. They assumed they would uncover a chaotic, mixture of contamination. DNA from medieval handlers, clergy, scientists, and visitors from around the world who had come into contact with it over centuries. That seemed like the most logical outcome. But the surprising part was this. The results didn't fit neatly into that expectation. Instead of a predictable jumble, some of the genetic markers appeared unusual and difficult to fully categorize. Certain sequences aligned with regions in the Middle East, while others seemed out of place or incomplete in ways that raised new questions. Rather than simplifying the mystery, the DNA evidence made it even more complex. What scientists expected to be straightforward contamination data turned into something far more puzzling. Anomalies that didn't easily match the historical timeline or handling patterns. Once again, the cloth refused to provide simple answers. Instead, it offered deeper layers of mystery, inviting more investigation, more debate, and more questions about what truly happened nearly 2,000 years ago. When researchers began analyzing the genetic material on the cloth with modern sequencing tools, the results were far more complex than anyone anticipated. They identified DNA traces linked to populations from South Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East. At first, the explanation seemed simple: centuries of exposure. The cloth had been displayed publicly, transported across regions, and handled by countless people over time. Contamination felt like the obvious answer. But then came the surprising detail. The genetic material wasn't found only on the surface where casual contact would leave its mark. Some sequences were detected deep within the fibers themselves, embedded in places that were not easily reached by later handling. That raised new questions about how and when those traces were deposited. Even more intriguing were the samples taken directly from the bloodstains. The DNA profile associated with those areas appeared unusually rare. A few geneticists, speaking cautiously, noted that certain sequences seemed incomplete or structured in ways they hadn't typically encountered. Ancient DNA can degrade over time, of course, but some of the patterns didn't align neatly with standard expectations of decay or contamination. The broader genetic picture also suggested something complex. The markers did not point cleanly to a single isolated population. Instead, they reflected traits commonly associated with the Middle East, along with signals connected to surrounding regions. That alone isn't impossible. Ancient populations were often more interconnected than we assume, but it added another layer of depth to the mystery. What truly caught attention was how carefully the results had to be verified. 3 independent laboratories reviewed portions of the data because the findings initially seemed so unusual that researchers wanted to rule out technical errors. Repeated testing confirmed that the machines were functioning properly. The sequences were real. They just didn't provide easy answers. This detail is important for another reason. If the cloth were a medieval European forgery, one might expect the dominant genetic traces, especially in critical areas, to reflect that context. Instead, the data suggested a far broader and older geographic footprint concentrated on a single piece of linen. It didn't automatically prove authenticity, but it complicated the forgery theory in unexpected ways. Meanwhile, discussion around the findings has remained cautious. The Vatican has historically taken a reserved position on scientific claims regarding the shroud, neither fully endorsing nor dismissing them. That careful silence has fueled speculation among observers, though no official statement has declared the DNA evidence to be conclusive proof of anything supernatural. Within the scientific community, opinions remain divided. Some researchers believe further testing with even more advanced tools could eventually clarify the anomalies. Others argue that ancient DNA studies are notoriously complex and vulnerable to environmental interference, urging restraint before drawing bold conclusions. For Barry Schwartz, however, the accumulation of evidence became deeply personal. For decades, skepticism had been his shield. He approached the cloth, determined to expose a fraud. Yet, as the years passed and more data emerged, chemical, photographic, forensic, and genetic, he found it increasingly difficult to dismiss everything as coincidence or clever artistry. Eventually, he devoted much of his life to preserving and organizing the research. He built and maintained one of the largest online archives of shroud data, making photographs, test results, and historical records available to scholars and the public alike without charging a fee. He often said that his Jewish background gave him a unique objectivity in the investigation. He had no theological agenda to defend. His commitment, as he described it, was simply to the evidence. In the end, the shroud remains one of the most studied and debated artifacts in history. The genetic findings have not rewritten textbooks overnight, nor have they settled the debate, but they have ensured that the conversation continues, drawing scientists, historians, and believers alike into a mystery that refuses to fade quietly into the past. He never approached the investigation with an agenda. He wasn't there to promote a church, defend a doctrine, or market a miracle. He saw himself as a technical professional, someone whose job was simply to document facts and report raw data. When Barry Schwartz first traveled to Italy in 1978, he openly admitted that he expected to expose a medieval forgery within days. He believed he would photograph a clever work of art, write up the findings, and go home satisfied that the mystery had been solved. Instead, what he encountered challenged him in ways he never anticipated. Over time, he would say half seriously, half thoughtfully that he went to Italy to prove the cloth was fake, but ended up discovering something that felt far bigger than he had prepared for. Not a tidy answer, not a simple hoax, but a question mark that seemed to point beyond science as he understood it. And that question mark still lingers over the scientific world today. We live in an era where humanity can send highly advanced robots to explore the surface of Mars. Agencies like NASA routinely operate machines millions of miles away with astonishing precision. Scientists have mapped the human genome, decoding the very blueprint of life letter by letter. We can manipulate atoms, split particles, and simulate the birth of galaxies on supercomputers. Yet despite all that progress, no laboratory has successfully recreated the image on the shroud in a way that matches its physical, chemical, and three-dimensional properties. Not with paint, not with heat, not with radiation, not with lasers, at least not without damaging the cloth in ways the original image does not show. That's what makes it so frustrating. The artifact sits there, ancient, fragile, and silent, while modern science circles it with more advanced tools each decade, still unable to fully explain how it came to be. For some researchers, the DNA findings represent the most intriguing layer yet. While ancient DNA studies are complex and often messy, the unusual patterns reported in certain analyses have added to the sense that this object does not fit neatly into expected historical categories. Whether those anomalies point to contamination, unknown variables, or something else entirely remains debated. But the fact that questions persist keeps the mystery alive. Here's the fascinating part. As scientific methods improve, the cloth doesn't seem to become less mysterious. It often appears more intricate. New imaging technologies reveal details that were previously invisible. Advanced chemical testing refines what we know about the fibers. Each step forward in science seems to peel back one layer while revealing another beneath it. Some see it as coincidence. Others see it as a kind of intellectual time capsule, an artifact waiting for humanity to develop the right tools and the right questions before its secrets can be understood. Ultimately, the shroud forces a personal decision. Is it the authentic burial cloth of a man whose death and legacy changed history? Or is it the most sophisticated deception ever created in the ancient or medieval world? Both possibilities carry enormous implications. What we do know is this. The stains on the cloth have tested positive for real human blood components. The image remains extraordinarily difficult to reproduce using known techniques, and the genetic and forensic discussions surrounding it continue to challenge easy explanations. For now, the cloth remains where it has been preserved for centuries, associated with terrain, studied by experts, debated by scholars, and examined by skeptics and believers alike. It stands almost like a bridge between the measurable physical world and questions that push beyond it. The scientific establishment tends to respond carefully, often emphasizing what is not yet known rather than rushing toward dramatic conclusions. After all, science depends on reproducibility and evidence, not on filling gaps with assumptions. When something doesn't fit existing models, the proper response is patience and further study. For Schwartz personally, the journey became less about proving or disproving a relic and more about confronting his own assumptions. Decades behind a camera lens, analyzing photographs and data, changed him. He once said that the investigation forced him to look at the evidence honestly without filtering it through expectation. And that may be the most enduring impact of the shroud. Whether one sees it as sacred, symbolic, or simply unresolved, it challenges us to admit that our understanding of history is still incomplete. Some mysteries shrink under the light of science, others grow more complex. Could future breakthroughs in genetics, chemistry, or physics finally provide clear answers? Possibly. Or the shroud may remain what it has always been, a puzzle that invites humility. Whatever conclusion someone reaches, one thing is certain. The questions it raises about history, belief in human origins, are far from settled. What do you think this discovery could mean for our understanding of the past?